jobs, the economy in general?
Wireless connections. Uncontrolled growth.
Uncontrolled growth, okay. Unplanned building. Okay. Many rural Americans hold negative views on the state of their local economy. When asked to rate the economy of the region where they live and work, a majority of rural Americans rate their local economy as only fair or poor. Rural Americans are divided in their views about future job opportunities. And when it comes to improving their local economy, rural Americans believe providing opportunities through long-term job growth and better public schooling would be the most beneficial. A great deal of national attention has been paid to challenges facing rural communities, and yet rural Americans themselves are optimistic about their lives. About 4 in 10 rural Americans say that their lives have turned out better than they expected, and a majority of rural Americans say that they are better off financially compared to their parents at the same age. Finally, a majority think their children will be better off financially compared to themselves. In addition, rural Americans value a number of aspects of life in their communities. Most say that they are attached to their local community, that they identify with the closeness of their local community, and that life in a small town and being good people are their community's biggest strengths. When asked about the most important reason why they chose to live in their local community, about a third say it is because of their family. Younger rural Americans, age 50 and below, are more likely than older Americans to say that they are active in efforts to solve community problems. And they also see significantly more discrimination against several minority groups than their older counterparts, which is something we mentioned earlier. So, I think that this survey is really interesting, and if you, all you have to do is search for Life in Rural America report, and it's a really great data set if you're interested in what people are thinking. They interviewed about 1,300 respondents in this survey. And I do think it gives a good sense of both the strengths of rural America, why people want to live in rural America, and also some of the very real challenges we're facing. I found this Gallup poll as I was doing some research, and I thought it was also interesting. 27% of people that responded to this Gallup poll said a rural area would be their ideal community, with an additional 12% opting to live in a small town. So collectively, 39% of people want to live in a small or rural community, which is far larger than any other set any other choice in the responses. The difference between where people actually live and where they'd like to live are telling, though. Just 15% say they live in a rural area, and 40% they say they live in a big or small city. So this Gallup reporter noted that if Americans did sort themselves according to their desires, there would be an exodus from the big cities and to a lesser degree from small cities and towns, accompanied by a movement to rural areas. Some of the reasons that people cited for wanting to live in rural areas: happiness and well-being tend to be higher in rural areas. Urban areas are also see higher rates of mental illness and poverty. Due to chronic underinvestment in infrastructure and housing, many cities are doing a poor job of keeping pace with the flow of new arrivals, which erodes the quality of life for everyone. There are drawbacks to living in the middle of nowhere, of course. The Pew Research Center recently reported that for a typical suburban and urban resident, the closest hospital is about a 10-minute drive away, whereas the average rural hospital is at least 17 minutes away. So I think, again, we live in a pretty lucky community in that we do have a hospital right here in town, and there's quite a few choices for healthcare in our region, but I'm sure you've all seen the reports of how many healthcare deserts there are now in rural America, people that have to drive well over an hour to get any sort of care. Even to deliver a baby, a lot of rural hospitals don't provide OB services anymore. So that's a real challenge to a rural community, to attract young families if you don't have pediatricians or obstetric surgeons. So, the final thing that I wanted to share with you all was this idea of rural wealth, which is also presented in the Smithsonian exhibit. Rural wealth is something that's studied by this group called the Rural Policy Research Institute. It's housed at the University of Iowa, but University of Idaho actually does participate in some of this work, and there is a rural studies program housed in the University of Idaho Ag School. And they do a lot of really interesting work, and I've met some of those folks working there, and it's really a really great group. So rural wealth creation is an approach to rural development that combines best practices of economic and community development. The approach focuses on increasing local capacity and coordinating regional efforts to better meet market demand through value chains. Success is measured by the ability of a region to increase 8 forms of assets or wealth. And the 8 forms that they choose to focus on are physical capital, which is built capital, including equipment, buildings, roads, bridges, telecommunication networks, and other physical infrastructure. Financial capital, which is the stock of money or other liquid financial assets such as stocks, bonds, and letters of credit. Human capital is the stock of productive capabilities of a population embodied in the education, skills, talents, and health status of that population. Intellectual capital is stock of human knowledge, innovation, and ideas that is embedded throughout a society. This makes it different from human capital embedded in individuals. So this intellectual capital is about our collective knowledge base. Political capital is the stock of influence, power, and goodwill held by individuals, groups, or organizations that can be held, spent, or shared to achieve specific goals. Natural capital is the stock of resources provided by Mother Nature, including clean water, clean air, natural landscapes, the climate, forest, wildlife, land, flora, and fauna. Social capital is the stock of trusts, relationships, and networks found in our civil society. And finally, cultural capital is the stock of practices, values, and sense of identity embedded in our society. So when you think about rural America, some of these are probably equally as applicable to large communities as our small rural places, but some I think are particularly well suited, these definitions of wealth, to our community. In particular, when you think about social capital, we certainly have a very active community. Our natural capital, we have a lot of natural resources that if we start thinking about it as how we're holding wealth in our community, that might help us in our conversations about how to maintain those capitals into the future, instead of spending them all down now, spending all our clean water down now, or polluting our clean air for short-term gain. If we think about it as this is where our wealth resides, we need to maintain these for the future. I think it's a useful framework. So the last thing I want to share with you is some implications for rural America if we consider that framework as the way we measure wealth in our community. So although the basic wealth framework is equally applicable in both urban and rural areas, it's important to note several important considerations. First, these 8 capitals are not evenly distributed across geographic space. Natural capital is much more prevalent in rural areas. Second, population density is a critical difference when thinking about rural and urban places. This has various implications, including how assets are distributed spatially, as well as how the flow of benefits from these assets are distributed and used. Finally, it's important to note that the assets found in rural areas often generate a flow of benefits that are essential in sustaining urban areas. Rural wealth is critical to urban wealth, and if our rural communities do not maintain our capital, then urban communities are going to feel the effects of that. So the narrative surrounding rural America is often negative and emphasizes the outmigration of rural youth, the lower educational attainment of rural populations, and the higher rate of poverty in rural America. This negative, while not necessarily inaccurate, is problematic. First, the narrative paints rural America with a very broad brush. Rural America is amazingly diverse, and while many rural areas and regions do struggle, others are thriving. Second, this deficit perspective, focusing on liabilities, makes it difficult to focus on amazing assets and future potential within rural America. The comprehensive rural wealth framework does just the opposite. By focusing on the totality of assets within rural America, this framing enables one to envision a more inclusive, diverse, and promising future built upon existing assets and in place. So diversity becomes part of our capital. It becomes part of that cultural capital and social capital if we lean into diversity, because it adds to our portfolio, right? so that's how we consider rural wealth, then I do think it makes us a more open community, and it probably makes us a more forward-thinking community. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about any of these topics, the New York Times just a couple days ago published a really interesting opinion piece called "Something Special is Happening in Rural America," and this author says that in fact there's a brain gain afoot in rural America. People are actually returning to rural places. For one, the cost of living is so much more affordable, and people my age, young families, they want to feel a connection to a community, and there really is no better place to feel like you can actually make a difference than in a small community. You can actually see difference happening on a very micro level. This author of this opinion piece, Sarah Smarsh, she wrote this memoir called Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth that was very well received. And she actually just launched a new podcast called The Homecomers, where she interviews people who've chosen to stay in rural communities, who are doing a lot of work to improve the communities they're living in. So she's got 5 episodes up now, and it's a really interesting podcast. Each episode's about 30 or 40 minutes. So if you need something to listen to while you're cleaning your house, that's when I listen to podcasts. It's a great option. I have to, of course, make the pitch that if you haven't seen it yet, please go down to the Chamber of Commerce office and visit Crossroads before it's gone on October 4th. We're really lucky to have it in Moscow, and again, that's thanks to the generosity of the Smithsonian Institution and the Idaho Humanities Council. If you want to think more about rural wealth, I invite you to join us for our History Happy Hour, which is next 2 Mondays from now, September 30th. It's a presentation by Lori Higgins, who's a University of Idaho professor, and she is updating a pamphlet she first created in 2012 called the Artisan Trails brochure, that elevates and highlights businesses in our region that are using heritage as part of their marketing. So things like local wineries, quilt shops, that sort of thing are elevated in this brochure, and of course we'll be at a winery, Coulter's Creek in Moscow, a really interesting example of a business that chose to start in a very rural community in Julietta. This is a free event, 5 o'clock on Monday the 30th. If you want to just have a feel-good feeling, we do have our Lanterns and Luminaries event the day before that, Sunday, September 29th, and we'll be honoring folks who have helped build Latah County's into what it is today. And finally, this event that I wanted to bring to your attention, it is on our schedules that we handed out, the calendar, but the Seeking Suffrage Lecture Series, this is the first of a 4-part series that we are planning. League of Women Voters of Moscow is one of the co-sponsors, as is my organization, and the University of Idaho College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences. And we are going to be commemorating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment.